The gradually outgoing European football season once again confirmed the trend of the ever-increasing popularity and importance of up-tempo playing style. If you want to know what is the most visible difference between the modern game and the one that took place 20, 30 or even 15 years ago, I would mention the transition phase without any hesitation. The current teams are way more skillful and inventive, smoothly moving from defense to attack within few seconds. As for the speed of ball circulation and decision making, it could easily strike imagination. It would be fair to say that in both these aspects, in the transition phase, football of high level has never been closer to the NBA, where high tempo is a traditional key element of action. The undeniable plus of fast play consists in the fact that each campaign it opens up unexpected opportunities for absolutely new teams, managers and footballers, putting in the spotlight entirely fresh faces. The other two main directions of football definitely couldn't boast the same. The combinational one is the most sophisticated and exalted of all, and therefore requires the personnel of the highest order at first place. Even the likes of Josep Guardiola, Zinedine Zidane and Thomas Tuchel couldn't win and perform in that their favorite manner, having at disposal mediocre footballers. Meanwhile, the pragmatic or typical Italian direction of play is in evident crisis, and during this campaign it even reached new heights. Almost all the prominent coaches that represent this particular tactical conception had a season to forget. Diego Simeone with his Atletico failed in the Champions League in a big way. Massimiliano Allegri spent at Juventus a year full of issues and grunt work without any significant reward, whilst Antonio Conte parted ways with Tottenham being full of bile and vitriol. Christophe Galtier and José Mourinho did better, but even they met the summer with a bitter taste in the mouth. The Frenchman is about to lose his job at PSG, and the Portuguese has pretty slim chances to find a better and more ambitious club than AS Roma after the anguishing defeat in the Europa League final and another lackluster campaign in the Serie A. Meanwhile, this particular dimension of play didn't bring a new successful manager for ages. Fast football is much more democratic in this regard. It would be an exaggeration to name Simone Inzaghi a revelation in a broad sense, but reaching the Champions League final with his Inter against all odds, the good-looking Italian certainly gained a lot of credibility and respect. Inzaghi, who in many ways reminds Jurgen Klopp and interprets football in comparable style, molded in Milan one of the most dynamic teams on the continent. 6 out of 19 Inter's Champions League goals, it's basically one-third, have been scored through fast breaks, while the Nerazzurri run 117.5 kilometers per match, which is pretty respectable number even for the modern standards. It's true that over the course of the Champions League playoff, the handsome Simone established special, almost intimate relations with luck, using it time after time with regard to the draw. But it's also true that the manager of Inter achieved this goal with heavily limited budget and with some players that most people couldn't envisage in the final of the most prestigious continental competition, even a few months before it actually happened. We are talking about Francesco Acerbi, Matteo Darmian, Federico Di Marco and some others. One simple fact speaks for itself. No one from the current Inter's roster played in the Champions League decisive match prior to that, but Inzaghi proved that pace, agility, intensity and sheer determination could mean more than big names. Eddie Howe and Vincenzo Italiano, the other two up-tempo lovers, also recently made a serious leap in terms of impact and quality, proving themselves on a much bigger scene. The Englishman has been known as a talented tactician from his Bournemouth days, but very few could predict that the Newcastle manager will lead the club to the Champions League football despite the fierce competition. In the meantime, Italiano, who made a name for himself at Spezia, propelled his current club Fiorentina to two finals, one of them in the Italian Cup at the hands and legs of Inter already brought defeat, but there is another one versus West Ham in Europa Conference League. Personally, I wouldn't be surprised at all to see Italiano at the helm of more ambitious side even next term. The option with Napoli looks pretty feasible at least. Simultaneously, Xabi Alonso spent a decent first season as a manager in big football, steering Bayer Leverkusen to the Europa League semi-final in the process. And you know what? The Spaniard also bets on fast high-intensity play. But it was the other Basque who created a furor lately. The collaboration of Sevilla that mired in deep crisis, and José Luis Mendilibar, a journeyman veteran coach with basically zero experience at international level, initially did not bode well. Even more so, it looked like a desperation move at the end of hopelessly spoiled campaign. But instead of seemingly inevitable failure, this partnership proved to be a masterstroke, and swiftly switching from the combinational possession-orientated football that have been cultivated by both his predecessors, Julian Lopetegui and Jorge Sampaoli, to up-tempo manner with high press and tireless running. Mendilibar not only got his team away from the dangerous zone in Primera, but also against all odds won the Europa League. On top of that, he came to the goal facing the most menacing opponents, Manchester United, Juventus and AS Roma. The quarter-final and semi-final rounds were particularly telling because Sevilla have beaten the opponents through speed and agility. It's amusing that before that, MU successfully passed two other Spanish teams, Barcelona and Betis, that performed incommensurably better in La Liga. There is little doubt that Sevilla would repeat their fate, stayed faithful to the initial passing-based style, but with a new weapon in the form of ferocious pace and stamina. The Andalusians proved to be a bogey opponent for Erik ten Hag's side that's still not fully shaken off its traditional weaknesses in the form of lack of movement and physicality. The battle with Juventus was more balanced, but it's pretty telling that Mendilibar forced his adversary Massimiliano Allegri to make adjustments no later than in the half-time of first leg. In the outset of this tie, velocity and agility of the Spanish side were so infinitely superior to Juventus' size that Allegri had to urgently search for an extra speed on the bench and unwittingly follow his counterpart's footsteps. Make no mistake, the Sevilla coach had a lot of fortune on his side too, especially in the grueling final against the pragmatic and brutal AS Roma, but it was not other than supplement to hard and brilliant work. It sounds astonishing, but prior to the season, the ever-emotional José Luis had effectively zero international experience barring two games in the long time ago abolished Intertoto Cup during Mendelebar's brief tenure at Athletic. He discreetly became only 15th manager in the last 40 years who has been able to win the major continental trophy from the very first attempt. So fast football is a perfect weapon to make a breakthrough. Using this style, it's much easier to catch an opponent off guard, but there is one massive issue. This kind of play very seldom gives stability and continuity through the years. In order to realize it, just look how seldom the teams that use these tactics are winning their respective national leagues. This term, all top 5 European championships have been conquered by the sides that are playing differently. Only Bayern, with Julian Nagelsmann in the dugout, had a legitimate chance to win the title, but the leading board of the German giant by the late match became so tired of the team's erratic performances that decided to change not only head coach but the type of football as well. By doing it, Oliver Kahn, Hasan Salihamidzic and company reckoned that the combinational and highly intelligent play which is practiced by Thomas Tuchel is a much more reliable method to win the Bundesliga. This approach could be and perhaps should be critically assessed in relation to the concrete Bayern situation, despite the fact that eventually Tuchel won the title after all trials and tribulations, but speaking in general, they definitely fought right. We could also recall that Liverpool, under the guidance of Jurgen Klopp, have won the Premier League just once over almost 8 years, being most of the time a truly formidable force. Personally, I would highlight two main reasons why fast football is not particularly effective on the longer runs. The first of them is related with the organics of play itself. The positional phase is still the most constant part of almost each game, no matter how much football is tipping towards supersonic speed. The sides that thrive on high intensity and pace are usually weak, or at least weaker, when they had to slow down and execute against defense which is grouped already. For instance, that's why Inzaghi's Inter, being so prolific in the Champions League, struggled in the Serie A versus minor opponents, losing at home to Empoli and Monza. Secondly, fast football is extremely energy consuming and wears out even the most resilient players quite quickly. Under these circumstances, it's almost impossible to retain a high standard of quality, especially if we remember how tough is the competition even within those who opted for exactly this style of play. It's highly characteristic that this term Klopp, the only acknowledged great head coach who trains speed at first place. Nagelsmann and Unai Emery went into the shadows somewhat, making way for the new, sometimes completely unexpected heroes of this genre. This only underlines the fundamental idea. It's easier to surprise than win on request, and it's tougher to retain a success than occasionally accomplish it. It's true with respect to football overall, and it's twice as true with reference to up-tempo style.